Before we begin, I would like to dedicate a brief message to all of our listeners, especially the Black community who are watching us. Here on the channel Plow of Twist, we do not support any type of racism, discrimination, or injustice. We know the importance of fighting for equality, and we are on this journey together, believing in a fairer world for everyone. Get ready, because you're about to follow an intense story full of twists and turns. If you like it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your comment. Now, enjoy the story. A white police officer, in an impeccable uniform and cold gaze, walks towards the man who was simply enjoying his vacation. He was relaxed, by the lake, surrounded by the calm of the place, when he was abruptly interrupted by an authoritarian voice that cut the air with the same violence as an invisible punch. Show your identification. Now. The man, confused, tried to understand the reason for that aggressive approach. He wasn't doing anything wrong, just resting. But the police officer had already made his judgment. The hardened face and impatient tone indicated that this was not a simple routine check. Not for him. I'm on vacation. May I know the reason for this approach? He asked calmly, but with an internal strength that barely disguised the growing tension. The police officer, however, didn't even bother to respond. With a sudden gesture, he snatched the identity card from the man's hand before he could even offer it. The humiliation came next, the tone full of contempt. Vacation? You're lucky you're not behind bars. Who do you think you are to rest in places like this? The shock of those words was like a punch in the stomach. That phrase carried not just prejudice, but it contained anger, an attempt to reduce man to something lesser, to someone who didn't belong in that space. He felt injustice pulsing through his veins, an open wound that reminded him of all the times his skin color had been a reason for distrust, for hatred, for unjustified fear. It wasn't the first time he had faced racism, but this time the attack was even more direct, personal, and undeserved. He was not just any man. And he certainly wasn't a criminal. The police officer, impassive, was about to put on the handcuffs. One detail, he had done absolutely nothing. There was no crime, there was no offense. Nothing. Just naked prejudice, personified in that man in uniform. The power in his hands was being used as a weapon, a clear attempt at humiliation. For the police officer, the simple fact that he was there, occupying that space, was already a crime. This is an abuse of authority, he said, now unable to contain his indignation. But the policeman laughed. A bitter laugh, from someone who knows that, at that moment, he holds absolute power. The power to crush someone on a whim. I'm the authority here. And I'm the one who decides what constitutes abuse. Those words resonated like a final verdict. The metallic sound of handcuffs being readied filled the air. There, under the scorching sun, the weight of injustice was brutally felt. He, who had dedicated his life to protection and honor, was now being treated like a criminal for the simple fact of being there, at that moment, in that place. The police officer had no idea who he really was, what that man had achieved, the battles he had already faced, and won. The world seemed to spin in slow motion, and the humiliation was almost palpable. But behind those tired eyes, something began to change. Desperation gave way to anger. Not uncontrolled anger, but a cold, focused anger that comes from the knowledge that justice somehow always finds its way. He knew he wouldn't let this go unpunished. Something bigger was coming, and the tide, which seemed to be against him, would soon turn. The police officer approached, confident, believing that this man, like so many others, would bow to his authority. But he was terribly mistaken. This was no ordinary man. What he didn't know was that fate was about to take an unexpected turn. The silence that hung between them was about to be shattered in a shocking way. But what happened after that moment of humiliation? How would someone who dedicated his life to justice deal with such injustice? What could that man do to the police officer that would shake everyone around him? Get ready, because the unfolding of this story is a lesson in justice, revenge and redemption. A story that will not only reveal the truth behind that approach, but will also make everyone question how far power can be taken, and when it should be challenged. What the general did to the policeman shocked everyone, but in a way that no one could have ever predicted. Marlin Cooper was the kind of man who carried the weight of the world on his shoulders without ever letting the burden show. At 45 years old, his erect posture and confident way of walking gave him the image of someone unbreakable, indomitable. He had earned the respect of many, but at his core, Marlin was someone marked by invisible scars. Raised in a Detroit neighborhood where few believed there was a way out, he not only survived, but thrived. Military discipline shaped his character, and respect for justice guided him in every step he took. Marlin had enlisted in the army at 18, determined to build a life away from the dangerous streets that had so often tempted him. He knew that the easy path was violence and crime, but he chose a path that required sacrifices. Within a few years, he rose through the ranks and became a respected leader. His career flourished, and he was soon recognized as one of the most brilliant military strategists of his generation, a man capable of leading with wisdom and, above all, with empathy for those under his command. But that week was different. For the first time in a long time, Marlin allowed himself a breather. He was on vacation, a rare break from his routine, and chose a retreat in a small town outside Detroit, on the edge of a serene lake. It was the perfect place to leave his stress and worries behind, a place where he could finally reconnect with himself and the simple joys of life. There, in the silence of nature, far from the sounds of sirens and the tumult of the streets, he hoped to find the peace he so deserved. Sitting on the shore of the lake, watching the sun slowly set, Marlin felt a tranquility that had long been unknown to him. He reflected on the battles he had faced, not just on the battlefield, but also in life. The silent struggles against prejudice and discrimination that, despite their status and achievements, were still a constant reality. He knew that the world outside the military was still brutal for men like him, and that the scars of racism, as old as the nation itself, continued to bleed. It was then that the sound of an engine in the distance interrupted his thoughts. A police vehicle approached on the dirt road that bordered the lake. Marlin almost didn't care, continuing to enjoy the landscape. But as the car approached and parked not far from where he was standing, something inside him tensed. He could feel the gaze of the police officer who got out of the car fixed on him, as if he were a prey being analyzed. The police officer, a white man named Thomas Riggs, got out of the police car with the typical air of superiority that men like him brought. He was new to the department, but he was used to patrolling areas where, in his opinion, certain people didn't belong. And in Thomas's mind, that black man by the lake, sitting so relaxed in an area he considered privileged, just didn't make sense. Thomas had grown up in an environment where people like Marlin were seen as a threat, and that distrust was ingrained in him in a way he didn't even question. "Hey, you! What are you doing here?" Thomas's voice broke the silence, full of authority and disdain. Marlin looked at him for a moment, surprised, but maintaining the calm he had learned to cultivate in pressure situations. He knew how to recognize an imminent confrontation. "I knew that, despite the uniform he was no longer wearing at that moment, his real battle was perhaps just beginning." It was a situation that, as much as he wanted to avoid, already seemed too familiar. "I'm just enjoying my vacation," replied Marlin serenely, without making any sudden movements, just observing. Thomas took a few steps forward, assessing the man in front of him with predatory eyes. He didn't see a retired general, someone who had once served his country honorably. All he saw was a stranger, someone he thought had no right to be there. "Can I see your identification?" demanded the police officer, his tone no longer a request, but an order. Something inside him bothered him. The fact that Marlin didn't show fear irritated him deeply. Marlin patiently took out his identity card. He knew what was happening there. "I knew that, for men like Thomas, it didn't matter who he was, but what he represented, a black man occupying a space that, in that police officer's mind, didn't belong to him." When Thomas took Marlin's ID, he looked at him with contempt, as if the name on the wallet meant absolutely nothing. For him, Marlon was just one of many others that he had seen throughout his life and judged without knowing. "You're lucky you're just on vacation," the officer murmured, a hint of menace in his voice. "But I'm watching. And any misstep, you'll go straight to jail." Those words, filled with racism and abuse of power, hit Marlon like a knife. He had faced discrimination before, but now, unarmed and away from his work environment, he felt vulnerable in a way he hadn't experienced in years. Thomas seemed to relish the power he wielded at that moment. It was as if, for him, Marlon's mere presence was an affront that needed to be corrected. The authority that the uniform gave him, combined with the subtle hatred he carried, created a perfect storm. He didn't know who Marlon Cooper was, but he believed he knew exactly how to treat him. The moment was filled with tension, and Marlon knew that there was nothing he could say or do that would change Thomas's mindset at that moment. The injustice was written all over the police officer's face, as clear as the sun that was setting on the horizon. What Marlon didn't know was where that meeting would take him, and what would be at stake in the next few moments. Little by little, the stage was set. Two diametrically opposed figures, each carrying the marks of completely different lives, but now connected by a chance encounter. A white police officer, full of prejudices and abuses of power. A black general, who spent his life defending justice, but now found himself caught in a web of racism and discrimination. The sun had already completely hidden, leaving the sky dyed in dark blue and purple tones, when Marlon decided to get up. The tranquil atmosphere of the lake had transformed into something dense, suffocating, since the policeman's arrival. Thomas Riggs, standing with the posture of a predator, still held Marlon's ID card. He swayed it from side to side, as if he wanted to prolong that moment, stretching the tension like a string that could snap at any moment. "You said you were on vacation, but that doesn't seem right to me," Thomas teased, without taking his eyes off Marlon, as if he were hunting for some mistake, something that would justify his attitude. "I'm a citizen like any other, exercising my right to rest," replied Marlon, maintaining control over his tone of voice. He knew that reacting angrily would be what the officer expected. I knew Thomas wanted an excuse, anything that could turn an ordinary situation into an arrest scene. The way Thomas looked at him made it clear that he didn't believe a single word Marlon said. For him, that man was not worthy of being there, of enjoying a place that he, the police officer, probably believed belonged to people of his color and social class. It was a dangerous game, where racism was hidden between the lines of every sentence Thomas uttered. "Where's your car?" Thomas asked abruptly, as if he were putting together an invisible puzzle. "Or did you just show up here out of nowhere?" Marlon took a deep breath, pointing his head in the direction of his parked car ahead. He knew what would come next. He knew that the next requirement would be to search the car, another stage in the abuse of authority that was unfolding before his eyes. "I want to see this car," said Thomas, already starting to walk towards the vehicle without even waiting for a response. Marlon followed him, feeling the weight of each step. He was being treated as if he were a threat, as if, for some reason he couldn't understand, his presence there was a provocation. But he knew the truth. It wasn't about what he did, but who he was. "There's nothing wrong with my car," Marlon said firmly, trying to maintain control of the situation. "You have no reason to do that." Thomas paused for a second, then slowly turned around, a sneer full of contempt appearing on his face. "I don't need a reason. I am the reason." That sentence, delivered with an almost mechanical coldness, penetrated deeply. It was the essence of what Marlon had always known: racism, when combined with power, became a ruthless weapon. He looked around, looking for some support, anything that could stop this escalation of abuse, but the lake was deserted. There was no one there other than the two of them. And Marlon knew that, at that moment, the only thing that prevented him from being another statistic was his patience. Thomas approached the car and began to inspect it, without asking permission. Marlon, standing, watched in silence, controlling the fury that was growing inside him. This was an outrage. He, a man who dedicated his life to justice and protection, now found himself the target of humiliation so great that his body could barely contain the anger. While Thomas checked every detail of the car, Marlon finally broke the silence. "You're crossing boundaries," he said, his voice now firmer. "This is an abuse of power, and you know it." Thomas stopped, stood up and looked him straight in the eyes. It was an empty look, devoid of any trace of humanity. For him, this was not just an act of authority, but a demonstration of who had control. "Limits?" Thomas repeated, as if the word were irrelevant. "Do you think there are any limits here? I am the law. And the law will put you in your place." Marlon clenched his fists, trying to contain the tension that was building up inside him. He knew men like Thomas. They knew that their strength came from the position they held, from a system that allowed them to abuse power without facing consequences. But he also knew that he would not remain silent in the face of such injustice. "No more. You're going to regret this," said Marlon, without raising his voice, but with a firmness that even surprised himself. Thomas laughed, shaking his head as if he found the situation absurd. For him, Marlon was just another man trying to resist something inevitable. He walked over, grabbing the handcuffs that dangled from his belt. "Let's see who regrets it, shall we?" said the policeman, approaching with handcuffs in hand. Marlon felt the blood pulsing in his veins. He never imagined that one day he would be in that situation. Precisely he, who always fought for justice, who dedicated his life to protecting what is right, was now at the mercy of a man who used the system to humiliate and oppress. That was a silent battle, fought in a field of racism disguised as law. The click of handcuffs got closer, but Marlon didn't move. He would not bow. Not this time. He knew that as much as Thomas felt in control, something much bigger was at stake. He still had cards to play, and what Thomas didn't know was that Marlon was no ordinary man. He wasn't just a helpless civilian. And at that moment, as the tension rose and the handcuffs gleamed in the dim light, the tide began to turn. Marlon felt that something was coming. Something that would change everything. He knew that story wouldn't end as Thomas imagined. The silence that followed Thomas Riggs' arrest was almost deafening. The faint light of the stars reflected off the calm surface of the lake, and the cold night wind seemed to carry with it the tension that still hung in the air. Marlon remained where he was, motionless, watching the police cars and federal teams slowly disappear down the road. Thomas, the man who had tried to humiliate him, was now trapped, taken by those he believed were above. The irony of that moment was inescapable. A cycle of injustice had been interrupted, but the marks of that experience still burned deeply in Marlon's mind. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of what had just happened. As much as I knew justice had been served, the feeling was not one of triumph or absolute relief. It was something more complex, a mixture of victory and a bitter awareness that this, however impactful it was, would not erase the long history of racism and abuse that he and so many others had already faced. Marlon knew that night would be remembered not as a simple moment of revenge, but as a battle won in a much larger and much longer war. As the last headlights disappeared over the horizon, he slowly walked towards the car. Each step seemed to echo the depth of what he had just experienced. The world would not change because of that prison. Thomas Riggs was just one cog in a system that, over the years, allowed men like him to operate with impunity. And yet, there was a certain justice in seeing him taken into custody. As much as Marlon knew that the consequences of that night were not over yet, he also knew that there was something more to be resolved, something within himself. While walking towards the car, Marlon was surprised by a call on his cell phone. The sound was a sudden interruption in the flow of his thoughts, bringing him back to the present. He looked at the screen. It was a familiar number. Answered. "Marlon, are you okay?" The voice was serious and full of concern. It was from an old friend, someone who had been by his side during his years of military service. "Yes, I am," replied Marlon, although his voice didn't exactly convey the calm he wanted to convey. "It's all sorted out here." There was a pause on the other end of the line. The friend knew exactly what "resolved" meant. Marlon didn't need to explain the details. They both knew the reality of the world they lived in, and the tension Marlon had just faced was not something unknown to either of them. "What are you going to do now?" asked his friend, his voice filled with genuine concern. Marlon looked around, at the serene lake and the emptiness that now surrounded him. What would he do now? The answer was not simple. Despite everything that had happened, something still weighed on his chest. Thomas Riggs' arrest was a symbolic victory, but there was a greater dilemma he would need to face. As much as the system had, at that moment, worked in his favor, Marlon knew that this was not the reality for many. He had spent years dedicating his life to protecting his country, and now he found himself facing a new struggle. An internal struggle, where the feeling of justice mixed with the need for inner peace. "I still don't know," replied Marlon, honestly. "But I'm sure of one thing, it doesn't end here." He knew there was a path forward, even though it wasn't entirely clear yet. Marlon hung up the phone and sat on the hood of his car, looking out at the lake. The still water reflected his own restlessness. He wasn't angry, but he didn't feel relief either. The truth is that, in moments like that, the line between justice and revenge became blurred. He had seen the policeman taken away, but would that solve the bigger problem? Would it resolve the years of discrimination and the faces of so many who, like him, suffered in silence? These thoughts invaded him as the night progressed. He knew that, however right he was in exposing Thomas Riggs, there was a moral void he needed to confront. The arrest of the police officer was just the first step. Marlon was not naive. "I knew that other men like Thomas would continue to exist, and the system, with all its flaws, would continue to allow abuse to occur. The problem wasn't a man, that's what he represented." And the question that now took over Marlon's mind was what he should do next. Marlon stayed there for a long time, alone, with his thoughts. The tranquility of the lake, which had once seemed like a relief, was now a mirror of his own inner turmoil. He wanted to believe he had done the right thing, but something inside him continued to question the price of that victory. As the hours passed, Marlon's mind wandered between what had happened and what was to come. He knew that the real battle was not just against men like Thomas Riggs. It was against a much larger system. And this led him to question what his role would be from now on. Could he just move on, get back to his life, or was this the opportunity to do something bigger, to stand up and fight for those who didn't have the same opportunities and defenses he had that night? This moral dilemma weighed heavily on his shoulders, and as the sky began to lighten with the first signs of dawn, Marlon knew he needed to make a decision. That night's victory was important, but it was far from the end of the story. He stood up, determined not to let that empty feeling continue. Whatever he did next, it would be for something bigger. Perhaps he was ready to fight a new battle, not with weapons or uniforms, but with the tools that justice and truth could offer. And most of all, he knew there were more people like him, waiting, fighting in silence. And for them, he needed to be ready to make a difference. Now, Marlon was prepared for the next stage. And he knew that this time, he wouldn't be alone. The sun was rising over the lake, spreading its golden light over the calm water and reflecting a new beginning. Marlon was still there, watching the horizon, feeling the freshness of the morning, but with his mind in a whirlwind of thoughts. The night before had been a definitive turning point in his life, a battle won against abuse, but also the beginning of a journey to something much greater than he had imagined. He knew that this incident with Thomas Riggs was not just an end point, but a starting point. A few days have passed since the police officer's arrest. The news of what happened quickly spread throughout the city, and the case gained national attention. Media from different parts of the country began to cover the story, showing the abuse of authority that Thomas had committed, as well as the way Marlon had handled the situation. Marlon Cooper's name was now all over the news, no longer as the respected general, but as the man who faced injustice head-on, without giving in to violence or hatred, but using the correct means to achieve justice. For Thomas Riggs, the world quickly collapsed. He was relieved of his duties while the investigation progressed. Accusations of abuse of authority, racist practices, and corruption quickly accumulated. Other cases of similar approaches committed by him over the years began to emerge. People who had remained silent out of fear now saw Marlon as a symbol of courage. The domino effect was devastating for Thomas. He was no longer the arrogant police officer who believed he was above everyone else. That brief moment of power he had wielded, humiliating someone he considered inferior, cost him not only his career, but also his reputation. Now, he faced the possibility of being arrested, just as he had tried to do with Marlon, but for much more serious reasons. Meanwhile, Marlon went on with his life, but the tranquility he was looking for on vacation seemed increasingly distant. He had become a symbol of resistance for many, something he had not planned on. People sought him out to learn more about his story, to hear his words of encouragement. He received messages from young black people across the country, who saw him as a model of strength and justice. This unexpected impact forced him to reflect on his own role in the world. One day, he found himself faced with an unusual invitation. A national civil rights organization invited him to lead a new initiative against institutional racism in the country's security forces. The invitation was clear: they wanted Marlon to use his experience as a general and his recent public exposure to drive real change in the system. The offer was tempting, but it also carried an immense responsibility. Marlon had spent years fighting on battlefields, but now he found himself facing a new kind of war, a war against a system that, for decades, perpetuated racism and discrimination. Marlon accepted. And that's how his life changed for good. He set aside what was left of his military life, fully embracing his new role as an activist and community leader. His words were now echoing in courtrooms, conferences and national debates, leading to the creation of new policies and guidelines to combat racism in police forces. He was no longer in the shadows. His name was synonymous with change. And as Marlon continued his journey of justice, Thomas Riggs saw his destiny come to fruition. Convicted of his crimes and the corruption he had perpetuated for years, he was sentenced to prison. What once seemed like a stable, untouchable career has completely fallen apart. He was no longer the police officer who wielded power over others, but rather a man who now paid the price for his actions. The irony of his arrest, given the way he had treated Marlon, did not go unnoticed. Marlon never needed to see Thomas taken to prison. He didn't need it to get closure. His satisfaction came from knowing that he had stood firm in his values, that he had fought with justice and not with revenge. Thomas's arrest was not victory, but rather the beginning of a much greater change. Marlon knew that men like Thomas existed in droves, but now, he had the power and platform to stop the same cycle of abuse from continuing. Months later, at a civil rights conference, Marlon stood up before a crowd that gave him a standing ovation. He looked at those people and saw hope. Not just hope in her figure, but in what she represented, the possibility of change, of peaceful resistance, of transformation. He began to speak: "I see myself here before you today not as a hero, but as an ordinary man who once faced a choice. I could have responded with anger, with violence, with the same hatred that was directed at me. But I chose a path. I chose to fight for justice, not just for myself, but for all those who have been silenced. The racism I faced that night is not new. I stood up to the abuse of power, and at that moment, I knew that my response would define not only my future, but the future of many. And today, I say to you, never give up fighting for what is right. Victory is not personal. True victory is change." The audience exploded in applause. Marlon, at that moment, knew he had found his purpose. He had become more than a symbol of resistance, he was an agent of transformation. And that, for him, was the most gratifying victory of all. At the end of this story, I want you, the listener, to reflect on the impact of the choices we make in the face of injustice. Marlon could have responded with hatred, but he chose justice. In our daily lives, how many times do we face situations where we can choose between the easy path of hatred and the more difficult, but correct, path of justice? Think about the times you have been silenced or seen others being silenced. What did you do? How did you react? This story isn't just about Marlon or Thomas. It's about all of us, about what we are willing to do to create a fairer world, where racism and abuse of power have no place. Leave your opinions and reflections on this story in the comments. What would you have done in Marlon's place? How can we, together, build a society where justice prevails? And, if you liked this story and want to continue following other impactful narratives like this, subscribe to the channel Tales of Twist. Here, the stories always bring twists, lessons and, above all, a space for reflection. Don't forget to leave your like and share with those who need to hear this message. Thank you for being with us, and until the next twist.